This week,
we are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil.
President Trump wants U.S. troops out of the Middle East. We take a look at the trillions spent on wars and the billions in maintaining U.S. military bases. And France's digital tax on big Silicon Valley tech that could escalate a trade war with the United States. Well, right now there are 200,000 US troops stationed at more than 800 bases in 70 countries and territories outside the United States. Despite President Trump's pledges to end the endless wars, the number of troops in the Middle East has increased. Well, the assassination of Iran's second most powerful figure, Qassem Soleimani, by US drone strike has led to the deployment of more troops to Iraq. And while Iran hit back and tensions appear to have eased for now, a shadow war goes on, which raises the question, how much does the United States spend on its presence in the Middle East? Well, since 9/11, taxpayers in the United States have spent $6.4 trillion on wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. That's according to the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University. More than 800,000 people have died as a direct result of fighting. According to US Central Command, there are between 60 and 70,000 US troops in the Middle East. Well, this is just a quick snapshot of that troop deployment. 14,000 in Afghanistan, more than 7,000 in Kuwait, 13,000 in Qatar, and 3,000 in Saudi Arabia. And the cost of maintaining bases and troops, including in war zones, is as much as $200 billion a year. That's according to David Vine, author of Base Nation, How US Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. Well, host nations do pay directly or indirectly for that deployment. After sending 3,000 troops and Patriot missiles to defend Saudi oil fields following an attack which Washington blamed on Iran, Trump said the Saudis are paying for it.
Saudi Arabia, at my request, has agreed to pay us for everything we're doing. That's a first. But Saudi Arabia, and other countries too now, but Saudi Arabia has agreed to pay us for everything we're doing to help them.
Well, joining me now via Skype from Boston is Glenn Carl. Glenn is a former Deputy National Intelligence Officer at the CIA for transnational threats. He's currently an assistant professor at Boston College and is the author of The Interrogator and Education. Glenn, the US maintains numerous bases right across the Middle East, and the RAND Corporation estimates it costs between $50 to $150 million a year per base. I mean, that takes up a huge chunk of the annual $700 billion US defense budget. So do the host nations really pay anything towards those costs?
Well, I've done a little research on this too, and the answer is a little murkier than I expected to find. It depends on which country we're talking about. Japan, South Korea pay substantial amounts, and in Europe there are substantial contributions of various natures financially accountable for the American military presence. In Iraq, I'm not so clear that they are actually making a formal contribution to hosting us, much as they are happy to have us, I'm sure. So there will be ancillary or secondary indirect costs that the host country is paying, certainly, but I don't think that they're paying some sort of a fee to host 6,000 American soldiers now in several bases.
Yeah, let's just stay with this issue of costs, Glenn, because the US seems quick to get into a war, but it's not very good at winning the peace, is it? And this all is very, very costly. Something like $6 trillion spent on wars since 2001. And here we are again with Iran. How do you see this all playing out, Glenn?
Oh, goodness. Well, that's the question that no one's been able to work out, particularly when the American political system is largely paralyzed, so that any sort of coherent, decisive action in international relations is very hard to do. There's been strong inclination on the part of half the country to remove the American presence from Iraq, which is viewed as a disaster, and yet most, I would say, professional national security officials or individuals think that it's necessary for the U.S. to have some sort of a presence there, which is independent of whether we are the ones who broke the crockery or are trying to put it together. but that to leave now would be a problem. So I don't see us leaving anytime soon, unless the incoherent and capricious man in the Oval Office actually manages to act upon his impulsions.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you make, Glenn, because President Trump says the US doesn't need Middle East oil and wants to get US troops out of the region. So what's the main reason then why the bases are still there? What are they actually doing?
Yeah, well, I think in the broad sense, the American presence in the Middle East is in slow recession. We are slowly withdrawing, I would say, from it being viewed as an existential, vital national security interest. Because it is true that just in the last 2 years, I think, for the first time since 1959, the U.S. has become a net exporter of energy. And alternative sources to petroleum are rapidly rising. So that is true. The U.S. has a less direct energy and financial interest there. Nonetheless, petroleum will be central to the world's economy, political systems, and stability for the remainder of your and my lifetimes. And therefore, the Middle East is a strategically vital area. And I don't see us losing our national interest there in that regard anytime soon there.
Glenn, let's just take a look, if we can, at Iran's posture in the Middle East. I mean, we know it has proxies in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon. But of course, let's remind our viewers that Iran is under crippling US sanctions. So how is it funding its influence and its wars right across the region?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you raised that point. It's something that we should debunk right away is the assertion that Donald Trump has made since he came onto the national scene politically, and just made recently again, he makes it all the time, that the nuclear deal with Iran Obama then gave $150 billion, I think he said is the figure, to Iran, with which Iran is now funding terrorism. That's a typically grotesque misrepresentation of the truth. What happened in the agreement was that funds that had been sequestered or frozen as a result of the seizure of the American embassy in 1979 were released. So this was Iranian money that simply was going back to them. It does appear true, however, that the Iranians used some of those funds to fund their proxies and their activities beyond the Iranian border, rather than building highways or schools. So that is true. You can always print more money, and the people can tighten their belts a bit more so that you can buy more guns. I mean, this tends to be how governments fund themselves. So those who suffer most immediately from financial sanctions and penury are the average citizen rather than the government's military establishment.
All right, Glenn Carl, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Counting the Cost.
Anytime.
Well, as tensions between the US and Iran escalated, our economics editor, Abid Ali, caught up with the chief executive of Rolls-Royce Motor Cars. The luxury brand was reporting record sales and has a strong presence in the Middle East, where he began by asking Torsten Müller-Otvos about uncertainty in the region and would that have an impact on the company.